Okay, here we go. Thank you. Okay, thank you for everybody for coming today. Wanted to also thank Don for taking time out of his day. Don is from City of Livermore. He's the cybersecurity manager. He's been there for 2.5 years. Prior to that, he was with Mays and Associates for over 20 years as the IT auditor and cybersecurity director. He has his master's degree from Biola and a bachelor's degree from American Military University in cyber management, and also currently pursuing another master's degree in public administration. Don, why don't you share with everyone your next adventure?
Well, thank you. I am, as of next week, I'm leaving the city of Livermore and I'm going to work for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Region 9, which covers California. And I'll be a cybersecurity advisor, and that role is designed to be an advisor to critical infrastructure partners, which includes local governments. If you're interested in it, my personal email address is on there. You can always hit me up on that. And basically that new role is to help local governments and critical infrastructure with cybersecurity. So there's a lot of free resources from the federal government, and I can hook you up with all of those if you're interested in the future. So take a look at that. So today I wanted to start off by talking about some of the recent trends in cybersecurity, and then I'm going to go over what our main thing is, and that is like, how do you get governance set up? Thank you for the congrats. And by the way, if you have any questions, go ahead and throw it in the chat, and as we go throughout the meeting, I will try to make sure I look over there to see it, but I want to answer your questions as we go. There's a small crowd, so it's not that big of a deal. And if you really want to speak up and do it, you can raise your hand, and we'll take you off mute, or you take yourself off mute, and then we'll go over it. So want to start off by talking about current trends, and then talk about governance and how you get executive management involved, and how is your board or your council's role in cybersecurity. So let's start off with the current trends. It's always exciting stuff. I like to start off with something funny because it gives us a time to smile and relax for just a second before we get into all that crazy stuff. So I like this one because I don't know, I'm getting tired of passwords. I don't know about you, but luckily the industry is trying to work away from passwords, but still currently in most systems, complex large password is still kind of one of the best things that you can do if you can't do multi-factor authentication. And multi-factor authentication is not a silver bullet, but it's definitely a lot stronger than passwords. In fact, you can have a weak password, an easy to remember password. You can use your dog's name as a password if you're using multi-factor authentication, because the bad guy, even if they know it, they don't have whatever the multi-factor is in order to log in as you. So that's something that I look forward to. And I know that some people are looking for what we call passwordless. So it's really interesting to think about that. Are we going to get to a position someday in the world where we don't have passwords anymore? We'll see. But definitely we're thinking about it. Cybersecurity is not always about trying to stop you from doing your job, right? At the end of the day, it's to make sure that you can do your job. I like this. I saw this on Instagram, or not Instagram, LinkedIn, and I thought this is really good because it's going to key in on some of the top points that I'm going to make throughout the presentation. And number one of them is, everybody seems to think when you talk about cybersecurity, it's all about technology, and it's really not only about technology. it's not IT's issue, actually, it's the businesses or the organization's issue, right? Your agency has a mission to accomplish, and it cannot accomplish that mission without technology. And so really at the end of the day, it's a business issue or an enterprise risk issue. It's really not an IT issue. And I'll explain that when we get to the second part of this. A lot of folks think that if you're a smaller agency, you don't have to worry about it. No, smaller agencies get hit just as much as big ones do. And we've seen that in the recent news when it comes to even local governments. Some folks think that cybersecurity is too expensive. Try dealing with a breach like Oakland's dealing with right now, and I think you'd understand that an ounce of prevention would be worth a pound of cure. We don't know how much that's going to cost. We don't know if that information will be made public in the future, but looking at what trends are out there, I think the average cost of a cyber breach worldwide is $4 million, and the average in the United States is $8 million. So it's more expensive to recover here in the United States. I think a lot of businesses and organizations in other countries may not be able to recover quite to the same level that we're able to, and maybe that's why. But the expense also obviously increases your cyber insurance premiums, but it also could impact your bond rating. And we're starting to see that happen, which means when your organization, city, or district borrows money, it may end up costing you more because you have to pay a higher interest rate. So those costs could last, a decade. So, right when you go out to issue bonds, so there are some really hidden expenses that don't always get calculated into those averages. They don't think about bond rating when they calculate that. It's usually just the hard costs of recovery and what it costs to to hire the folks to do the work that needs to be done. So, and some folks think that cybersecurity is too complex, and some of it is common sense. I'll agree with it. And some of the things that you deal with are very complex, but you can usually explain it in a very simple metaphor or way of explaining it in such a way that it's not as complex as it really sounds. I mean, it sounds really complex, but the basics of security that you would talk about in securing your house by locking the door and all that kind of stuff are the exact same thing that we talk about in cybersecurity. It's just more technical, right? But it's the same principles, right? And I think we'll see that as we go through some of the stuff that we talk about. I like to talk about this one. I know last year, Cyber Threat Defense Report kind of came out with this and said, "Hey, what's the number of successful attacks that you've had over time?" And notice that most organizations get hit between 1 and 5 times, but then after that, we get organizations. Over 10% of organizations get hit more than 10 times with an incident. So we've switched in the industry now. We don't talk about, is this going to happen or is it possible? We're like, it's going to happen. Are you prepared for it? Right? There's a different mentality now, that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And when it happens, are you going to be able to successfully weather the storm, so to speak? Are you going to be able to detect it as quickly as possible? Are you going to be able to recover as fast as possible and as completely as possible? So you're seeing the talk from cybersecurity professionals is going more in that direction, not about prevention, because we know that we can't prevent it. It's going to happen. Somebody is going to click on a link. I mean, it's just, we can't stop them from doing it. We can try as much as we want. But I think one of the things that most people don't realize is that the bad guys typically use social engineering against us, and it's one of the number one ways that they get into it. And so they're trying to hit the weakest link, and that's people. And so it's really not quite as sophisticated as we always think. It's typically something as easy as sending an email with a link on it so somebody can click on it. And since January, we've really seen an uptick in the sophistication of those types of emails. You used to get an email, and I used to have some examples. I really should get an old one and a new one. I got ones from the 90s, right? And they were just absolutely terrible emails. Anyone who read it and fell for it, you feel like, oh, well, you deserve to fall for it, because they were so bad, right? They didn't, the English was completely incorrect, that nothing was spelled correctly, no punctuation, completely easily understood that it was a fake email. Today, the attacks are so sophisticated that they are actually using information that they gain from public information sources, which could include council meetings, to implement that, and then using AI to craft an email that sounds like it's really coming from somebody that you really are expecting an email to come from. So they're doing a little bit more research, and they're using AI to get past all the grammar issues and all that and make it very compelling. So, uh, but that's not really that sophisticated, is it? That's something that almost anybody could do, right? It's not a very sophisticated attack. So they're not coming across at us in a way that is so sophisticated that we just can't handle it. No, they're coming through with very easy attacks. They just want someone to click a link, grab their credentials, and then once they got their credentials, they're in your system. And then even if they're in your system, they may send out emails from that email box that they got into, as if they are that person, to trick more people and get more credentials across your organization. So not sophisticated at all, but very damaging, right? And so that's the thing that we want to look at. One of the things that always comes up that we talk about this, and I've talked about this last year as well, and it was even announced by one of our council members, like, how much do we spend on cybersecurity? The problem is that's the wrong question they ask. When you talk about budget, you obviously should talk about risk before you make decisions on budget, right? That's, enterprise risk management 101, and cybersecurity is no different than that. And that is, what is the impact of changing this or adding to the budget or subtracting from the budget in the area of cybersecurity spending? How does that impact the risk to the organization? And that's the question that needs to happen. And it's typically void from most budget cycles that I've seen. Nobody justifies taking away budget. Now, when I write the budget here for the city of Livermore, I talk about, here's all the line items, here is the risks that it's addressing, and here's the statistics that we currently have that's available to me about the likelihood of that type of risk actually happening to the city. However, when the decisions are made at the executive level, that's not always considered, right? They don't necessarily look, oh, how is it going to affect the risk? Sometimes, and this is a bad way to do a budget, this is a lazy way of doing a budget. I worked for a financial firm for 20 plus years that did audits, and you'd see oftentimes they say, well, we need to save 10% off the total budget. Okay, so let's go to every department and cut 10%. That is the laziest way of doing it. I don't know any other way to say it. I'm sorry if that's how your organization does it, but that's just lazy, right? You really have to cut the budget depending upon what your mission is, like what things do we need to have in place, and then two, what are the risks, right? At the end of the day, if the police department doesn't have enough money to buy bullets, you don't want to cut money from their budget for their bullets. They can't pay if they don't have any, right? It's going to put you in a significant position for risk. And you don't want to cut on training on police officers either, right? That's going to put your organization at higher risk. Easily to understand, right? That's the same thing with cybersecurity. So I don't know why some folks don't look at it the same way, but some don't. And I think it's maybe because cybersecurity is kind of a newer, situation, or a newer phenomenon. And I think that that's something that we have to watch out for. There's a bias, and they talked about it in Harvard Business Review. I think last year, summer, they had an article that talked about, focusing more on making business decisions based upon information rather than making decisions based upon gut intuition. There's a bias that some people have, especially if they get later in their career, to say, I've always done it this way, and that's always worked for my career, so I'm going to go with my gut and do this, instead of going with the empirical evidence, right? That, cyber attacks are up, right? When you started your career 30, 40 years ago, cyber attacks weren't even an issue, right? Now they're a huge issue. So if you continue with that mindset, you're going to miss those things. So that's part of it, is trying to make sure that you understand when you look at your budget that we base it on information that we have. So one of the questions always comes up is, like I said, council asked me this question once, is like, what percentage are we spending on the budget, and how does that compare to everybody else? First of all, you can't compare yourself with everybody else. One, every city is different, and every risk is different, and each one of organization has different exposure areas, and so you need to really focus on the exposure areas and reduce risk to an acceptable level. Right now, I can tell you, based upon the numbers that we have, the average, depending upon who you ask, GFOA said it was 2%, and that was like 2 years ago, I think, that they came up with that number. ICMA also 2 years ago came up with a 0 to 10%. I think there's another a state level survey that was done for state governments that said it was closer to 15%. However, now, so you think, well, are those good numbers? Or are they not numbers? And again, is it mitigating risk to an acceptable level? Organizations outside of government are spending about 35% of the IT budget on cybersecurity. So there's a huge difference there, right? So we probably, it's a good guide. We shouldn't go by it, but you think about it. Think about this for a second. Safeway, right? The supermarket. They have two lines of business. They have online grocery shopping that you can have either delivered or picked up, and then they have brick and mortar. You show up at the store and you buy your own groceries and you check yourself out, or you have someone check you out. So if they're spending 35%, their risks are really kind of in two different buckets, right? The online store, and then the inventory database, and then really talking about their point of sale system, right? So they got very little things that they need to worry about. They don't have a lot of different things. Now think about a city. How many lines of business does a city have? City of Livermore, we have an airport. We have a water treatment plant. We have public works. We have public safety. We have a library, right? So we have a much broader area that needs coverage for security, cybersecurity, than a normal business would. And yet businesses are outspending us on cybersecurity. And they're in the business of not wasting money. They're in the business of making money. And so, they're not spending as much as they probably should or could. So if you take those averages together, you can kind of get a general idea that maybe local government's not spending enough. And maybe that's why we're continuously in the headlines. So that's just something to consider. But again, those are just soft rules, not hard rules. Wouldn't try to make a budget at 35%. It's really should be about, are you mitigating risk? And is it at an acceptable level? A lot of things are changing. Cyber insurance costs are going up. There's usually not enough staffing or budget to take care of all of the things that need to be taken care of. And a lot of things in the world that have changed recently, whether it be COVID-19 sending everybody home, and now people hybridly working, partially home, partially at the office. There's remote connectivity that we had never seen before. Have you actually gone back? I mean, COVID happened and you had to send everybody home and you put everybody on remote work, but did you do it securely? Right? That was the question. Or is it the most secure that it could be? And the question really comes up today is that now that COVID's kind of over and we are back to the office and most of us have now accepted a hybrid workforce, have we gone back and said, okay, did we do that too quickly? Did we go back and is it the most secure way that we have remote connectivity? And so that becomes a question. Then the Ukraine war is just a nightmare as far as cyber warfare goes. There's probably more going on in the cyber world as far related to the Ukraine invasion than there is in actual guns and bullets, although there's lots of that going on too. There's just a ton of cyber activity all around the Ukraine, trying to destabilize them and destabilize anybody that's helping them. So unfortunately, that is definitely spilling over, whether most of us realize it or not. We are all a part of that war, whether we understand that we are or not, right? And of course, cyber insurance is what everyone wants to talk about. And I'm not going to go too much over it. I think that Tony has other sessions that he has here that he's gone over some of the recent changes and stuff like that. But, we're starting to see, increases. Last year kind of jumped up a lot. It's going to start to stabilize, we think, in the near future, hopefully. crossing our fingers on that. But it's really only going to stabilize once the insurance folks kind of understand and can have some kind of actuarial tables for them to make decisions on what risk is. Right now, they don't have enough information to do it. What they are focusing in on is pricing you based upon your security posture, which is a good thing. So they're saying, hey, if you have less risk, we're going to get you a better deal. But they're looking at that risk, and they're looking at things that can reduce that risk in an easy fashion, right? So you're seeing that there is a requirement for multi-factor authentication. And one of the reasons for that is, like I said earlier, you can get rid of the passwords. The password becomes meaningless if you have to also have a token in order to log in. And that can kind of thwart a lot of threat actors and what they're trying to accomplish. So that's a good thing. It's skyrocketing. We don't need to talk about that too much. You're starting to see, though, on cybersecurity insurance, there's talk, and there was a lot of talk last month about looking at monitoring your network live for your current security risk and charging you accordingly. This is not new for the not new for the insurance industry. A good example of this is those those insurance things for auto insurance, where you can plug it in and it will monitor how you drive, and the safer you are of a driver, the lower your premiums, right? So they're looking at that as well in the cyber side of things. Now the question is, like, how are they going to get that information? And then does the way that they get that information open us up to any other risks, right? So it's going to be an interesting topic to go through, but they want to come up with some type of way of actually measuring risk as it goes. You know, as an auditor, when I was at Mays and Associates, I had a graphic of this. It's really funny. It's a bumpy road with potholes, and then there's one area that's patched and it looks like it's brand new, and then it goes back to potholes and all this stuff. And it said something like, and then the areas that had the potholes were before the audit. The audit was where it was all nice and clean, and then afterwards was after the audit. And we always saw that when we would look back over history, it'd be like, okay, we came out to do an audit last year. You guys were really good at this, but then look, you know, a month later, you guys weren't doing this thing that you said you were doing, you know, from last year. So it's interesting to see that, you know, if you ask the questionnaire once a year, they'll be really good when they get up to the questionnaire and say, okay, we got to put all this stuff in place, but then it goes back to the way it was. And that's unfortunate. So the idea of going into a continuous mode is monitoring risk as it changes, and that might actually be a good thing for organizations that have good cyber hygiene. So it's hitting local governments hard. It's getting to the point where some local governments are trying to say, okay, do we need to do self-insurance, and what does that look like, and how much do we need? And that's going to be a tough one, right? Because we're talking about the amount of money that it costs organizations to respond to these incidents. And if it's between $4 and $8 million, that's, you know, kind of heavy. And, you know, depending upon the size of your organization, because if you look at Atlanta or Baltimore, both of those were closer to 20 million. And it's important when we talk about averages to take that into consideration. If you're a larger city, you're probably going to be closer above that 8 million average that's in the United States. Like for the city of Oakland, I'm just guessing out here, but I'm thinking it's going to be well over $8 million. I'm sure it's going to be. And I don't know what their insurance coverage is, but I'm wondering that it's even close to that. So it'll be interesting if any of that information comes out here in the near future. You also have insurance providers saying, hey, you know, if we can link this to the Ukrainian war, we're not going to cover it because we don't normally cover warfare. This is going to make it really difficult for local governments. And I'll talk maybe a little bit about this later, or maybe I'll just mention it now. When you look at nation state threats, when you look at the way China looks at us, or the way Russia looks at us, or the way Iran looks at us, they do not look at the federal government as the bad guy. They look at all the United States as the bad guy. And as far as they're concerned, a local government, state government, or federal government are all the same to them. They don't see them as being different. So attacking the local government is the same in their mind as attacking the federal government. And I don't think that what we've understood that from our point of view, being local government, that hey, they're looking at us as if we're part of the federal government, and we're a weaker target than the federal government. So yeah, they're going to attack us. All right. Um, and we see that. We see a lot of nation states attacking local government. So it's something that um, it's going to this playing out as far as our insurance means that we may need to be somewhat self-insured for that, because we may have an incident where we may not be able to be covered for that. So it's interesting. So there's a lot of talk about reporting incidents. That's coming. That was already approved by. There's one for the federal government requiring it. Other states are trying to set up some type of uh, requirements as well for reporting that. What you end up actually finding is you'll see in the news, you'll say, okay, like last year they said 200 and some odd local government, or is it 300? I forgot what that number is. It's later in the slides. They said this many local governments got hit last year. The problem with that is if you talk to incident responders, that's only the 200 that became publicly aware of, that the public is aware of. There are, what did you say, 3 times as many that are not reported. So if you say that there is 200 that are actually happening, there's another 600 that were not reported that are not a part of that number. So when we talk about the numbers that are available to the public, you have to understand there's a lot of agencies that, decide not to disclose it, and the bad guys don't disclose the information either. And maybe that's because they pay the ransom, and maybe it's not. So the numbers can be a little bit deceiving. So you have to be a little bit careful about those. Now, the insurers, they get involved in it, and they have probably better accurate numbers on how many of those, how many actual incidents happen per year. And they would want that for their things. Now, the Strengthening American Cybersecurity Act, they're going to say, hey, you have to report it if you're critical infrastructure. That means all of us have to report if we have an incident. The question is, what kind of incident we have to respond? If we get a phishing email, do I have to report that? If somebody falls for it, but then the bad guy doesn't get into our system, is that really a breach? Do I really have to report it? Those questions the CISA has to kind of come up with and make the rules for. So the bill was just, hey, you need to report it. You're going to do it within 72 hours or 24 hours if you're going to make a payment for ransomware. But they don't tell you is like what constitutes a breach, right? And that is really legal terms. And so your city attorney, if you have one, is the one that's probably going to be having to delve into that area, because right now it's kind of ambiguous. The rules haven't been made, but they're going to be made. CISA has 24 months to do it, but I think they were going to try and do it within 12. That's last I heard. So I don't know. We're going to find out soon, though, that what we're going to have to report to and when and how and all that good stuff. So the good thing about that is we should have better numbers on actual attacks, which can help us then use that information in our risk calculations. Right now, if you're using risk calculations, say, well, 200 local governments got hit, so what's the likelihood of us getting hit? You got to understand that that's not an accurate number. So your risk is going to be a little bit less than it actually really is. So you have to be looking at that. And it's going to cover the critical infrastructure areas, and you can kind of see all these different areas. And I've highlighted in gold the ones that are definitely local government kind of falls into these areas for sure. Some of us have transportation systems. Some of us have water and wastewater. Some of us we all have government facilities, right? Some of us do emergency service. A lot of us do emergency services. Some local governments do energy as a utility, and most dams. So some of these other areas we're not necessarily involved in. We may also be in healthcare and public health. That one should probably be highlighted as gold. A lot of counties, not very many cities get involved in healthcare other than EMT level type stuff. But usually when I talk about healthcare, I talk about doctors and surgeries and hospitals and that kind of stuff. But counties often are involved in that. So that's another area where we're going to fit into. And here's a good example of where the numbers can be a little bit skewed when we talk about that. So the last reporting that we had of local governments being hit was 2,323, which is like a lot, right? And we noticed that attacks were increasing, but then you get a report like this, or where is it? You get these reports that, hey, in the first quarter of 2023, it's gone up 7%, right? Attacks have gone up 7%. That doesn't mean that breaches have gone up 7%. That's just the amount of attacks that we're seeing. So they're increasing. We also noticed that they're increasing specifically in towards the NATO members, which we're a part of it, not necessarily attacking us directly right currently under this attack, but clearly it is targeting NATO to cause disruption because they're, supporting Ukraine in the war. And we're seeing like annual growth of like 600%. This is crazy. There's not like any other risk that you're going to deal with a city that's growing by 600% annually, right? This is huge. And one point that I think that needs to be made all the time is that it's the number one risk that local governments have. It may not be the greatest impact you have. Obviously, if you have an officer involved shooting, the impact of that's going to be a little bit more expensive, probably. But the likelihood is less than you having a cyber incident. In fact, a cyber incident, you're like at 97%, you're going to have one eventually. So the likelihood of it happening is pretty high. Now, how much damage that does and how much it costs you is completely up to how much we, prepare for it, right? And that's what we're talking about. Some other statistics that kind of help with that, they say cyber attacks are more likely to bring down an F-35 jet than missiles. You think about that. The ability to get into the electronics, and all of our warfare machines rely on electronics. If they can get into the electronics either through the supply chain or by breaching it directly, you can take those devices out. So that's a huge thing, right? We see that about 75% of targeted cyber attacks start with email, which is what I told you about. Again, not sophisticated. It's just sending an email, right? It's just trying to figure out the right message to get somebody to click or log in or do whatever they want them to do. So cybercrime costs are growing 15%, and it's estimated to reach 10 trillion by 2025. That's just 2 years from now. We're looking at the cost going up to 10 trillion. We're looking that there's about 4.2 million active cybersecurity professionals across the globe, but we need about 30 million to fill all the gaps. And we don't have 30 million qualified cybersecurity professionals. That means your local government is going to have a really hard time keeping or getting quality cybersecurity professionals because it's just the market is really tough out there, and organizations that are willing to pay more are going to get the 4.2 million that are out there. And so a lot of organizations, and this is where you're going to probably have to look at collaboration, partnering with other local agencies to say, okay, what kind of cybersecurity expertise do we need? Do we need a CISO? Can we share a CISO? We can't afford one for ourselves, but can everybody in the county, through the county, hire one person to work with all the local governments in the county? That's an idea that a lot of places are starting to talk about. And I think it's a good idea because rather than leave the small organizations completely defenseless, at least if you at the county level can get a cybersecurity or a chief information security officer that can be available to those smaller entities, then those smaller entities will have a greater impact of increasing their security and awareness for those things than they would if they were by themselves. Obviously, by themselves, they can't afford it. So collaboration is going to be a good thing. Insurance market's going to expand because of this, obviously. They're starting to sell cyber insurance for individuals now. So you're starting to see a whole new market. So lots of stuff is doing that. Interesting numbers. I love these ones. 300,000 new malwares are delivered via email, are created every day. 300,000 worldwide. That's a lot, right? And 92% of that malware is being sent by email. So it's not just the emails, where you want someone to click it. It's also just the one that has the malware in it. And that's one of the favorite ways of doing it. So I mean, that should be a hint, right? We should be looking at that and saying, okay, where's our greatest level of exposure? Email. Okay, so what do we need to do to protect email as best we can? right? If they're always looking at a budget, I'd say, okay, let's spend some extra money on the email part of this, the filtering and the maybe getting some AI to look at the email, to look for trends and look for malware, and doing that. Malware is not just on email, it's also on websites. It's also on apps that you download from the App Store. We've seen that in the news lately as well. So malware is kind of everywhere, and you got to be really careful. You can't really trust a whole lot of anything, right? Um, so that's just some of the statistics. Here's one of those numbers. In 2022, they say over 200 government educational healthcare orgs got hit in 2022. Again, but those are only the ones that were reported. And from incident responders telling us that, you have take that number and multiply it by 3, and that's actually how many they're seeing. So we're still seeing, over 1,000 hits in local governments, and that's just in the U.S., right? Local governments across the world are being hit. London was recently hit, Ontario, and Canada was recently hit. So there's a lot of, when you look at these numbers, understand that when you just talk about just the U.S. versus numbers. That's the one thing about statistics. I get all these statistics. Everybody keeps on quoting the $4 million is the average cost of a breach. But that average cost of breach is worldwide. The average cost of a breach in the United States is 8 million, right? So what number should we be really looking at? Probably the US number and not the other numbers. But so you can see that counties are being hit now. Cities are still being hit. Schools are being hit. Schools have been like trashed lately. There's been a lot of hits since the beginning of the year. In fact, I'm looking at, since the beginning of the year, over 50 different schools that I'm aware of that have been hit recently. So a number of 200 last year, and the 50 are all here in the United States. So it's kind of interesting to look at those numbers. But I think we're going to start seeing some more reporting once reporting happens. LA school, ransomware is attacking, but they're also then releasing the information if we're not paying it. So hackers are attacking everything they can. So you can see that they're attacking the school districts, they're attacking the housing authorities. So they're focusing in on some of the smaller, organizations. It's not just the Oaklands that they're trying to hit. They're trying to hit anybody they can hit. So Housing Authority in Los Angeles is not a huge government agency. It's not a small one either, but it's not, as big as the city of Oakland or this county, obviously. But it's still under attack. So we even have counties being hit, like Tehama County got hit, but that one wasn't ransomware. Again, that one was more of a trying to get them to make a payment via email. So there's different types of stuff. There's been some Social Security number breach also from Tehama County. So they've had a couple different things happen up there in that county. Remember, I said some organizations get hit more than once, and that's more likely to happen. So, but you think about it, you think, well, we're probably doing a pretty good job. Well, I would have thought that the U.S. Marshals system had their security act together, but apparently they don't either, right? They got hit too. So if they don't, do we really feel like we are really that safe? And I don't want to be doomsday, and I'm not trying to leave with FUD, but because it's not about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's like, no, we're pretty certain that you're a target. That's a given. You're a target, and the likelihood is pretty high that they're going to get you. So the question is, like, how do we prepare for it? So I'm not trying to scare you to death, but it's still happening. Microsoft warned just yesterday that China is attacking U.S. infrastructure. This is one of the things that we've noticed. Is something that was brought up at a conference 2 weeks ago, at RSA conference, that there was a plan released that China was planning to attack U.S. critical infrastructure before they try to invade Taiwan. So that would have a huge impact on our supply chain. A lot of chips and stuff that we use for electronics comes from Taiwan. And that's always been a contentious area. And China has always contested that that's their property and they want it. And of course, Taiwan always rejects that. And I think with Russia moving in on the Ukraine, maybe China feels like it can do that. Don't know what they're thinking. Don't have intelligence on that. But it's interesting that we're seeing an uptick in U.S. infrastructure attacks, and that was brought up at the RSA conference this week. So we may see another war. And again, the cyber warfare is spilling out outside of that. So what can we say? People are actually paying the ransomware. Local governments are doing it. So this is just in the last 5 months. All these headlines that I'm giving you are from the last 5 months. So a lot of stuff's happening. You may have heard of San Bernardino County getting hit, and they decided to pay the ransomware of $1.1 million because they, whatever information they had, they wanted to make sure that the bad guys didn't release it, and they wanted to make sure they get their systems back up, which tells me their ability to react and respond to it was not up to par. In other words, they're not able to recover without doing this. Or they may have made the decision, it's going to cost $10 million to recover. 1.1 is easier number to swallow. Budget's tight, so let's do that. Again, it was their decision to do that, but they're paying, right? And so that encourages the bad guys to keep on doing this, right? We understand that, right? If crime pays, they're going to continue to do the crimes, and it pays in this one. Little Rock School District paid. A little town, I think what they were called, Oakdale or Oak something. I don't think that's in California. It's somewhere back east. Anyways, they hit and they paid a ransom. So you're seeing that people are paying the ransom. And this is, again, a troubling thing because it's going to mean that we're more likely to get hit. And again, like the little thing like the Little Rock or this other little town, that doesn't make national news sometimes. And so our perception of local governments getting hit may be distorted, because if I went up to our city manager and asked them, hey, how many local governments have been hit recently, they'd probably mention Oakland, and then they'd be struggling to mention any other ones, right? And there's a lack of awareness that we are under attack and that we're constantly being attacked, right? So obviously Oakland got hit, and it was very disruptive for them, and their systems were out for quite some time. And I don't know that they're fully 100% back up online. I know that for us to have everything back to the way it was for the city of Livermore, it took 2 years. But to get everything back up and running so that everything generally worked and people could go about their business and do their job took about 2 months for us. So it seems to be about the time that it takes to recover. So if you get hit with a big thing, you're looking at least probably 2 months to recover, something along those lines. Remember, BART got hit earlier this year or last year. I'm not sure exactly when the hit, but they got hit. And maybe you heard that Modesto got hit as well in January. Modesto is a little bit larger of a city, but we had city of Oak Ridge, New York, or New Jersey Police Agency got hit, and then Dallas just got hit, and a Dallas school district also got hit. Separate attacks, but the one interesting thing about many of these that may not be apparent to all of those, but in every one of these instances here, criminal justice information was in the attack. Police and safety was attacked in there in some way. BART has their own police, right? So their systems were affected there. 911 was affected in ransomware. In Modesto, it was the PD that was attacked. It wasn't the rest of the city. Oakland, it was also. All of them are focusing around the police departments. And oftentimes you would think in most organizations, the police departments are the most protected because they're following CJIS guidelines. This is telling us otherwise. Right? We're not doing enough on our public safety side to protect those systems. And so we need to consider that and think about that as we move forward. This is the wonderful little letter that started printing out on all the printers in the Dallas. I thought it's funny, but it's not funny, right? It's funny because it's a little bit whimsical, but it's not funny if you're the city of Dallas. But it's also not funny if you're a cybersecurity professional because you're like, oh, another one. The I think some of the things that they say, I'll just read it to you in case you can't see it, just in case it's too small on your screen. If you're reading this, it means that your systems were hit by Royal Ran. Please contact us via the given address. In the meantime, let us explain this case. It may seem complicated, but it's not. Most likely what happened was you decided to save money on your security. Alas, it was a result of your critical data was not only encrypted, but also copied from. And I think it cut off on the thing, but from there, it can be published online. Then anyone on the internet from the dark net and even your employees will be able to see your internal documentation. And then they talk probably personnel files and all that stuff. Fortunately, the bad guys have you covered, right? They offer you a unique deal. I mean, this sounds like a total salesperson, right? For a modest royalty, get it for our covering you up for your reputational, legal, financial, regulatory, and insurance risks. Put it simply, your files will be decrypted and your data will be stored and kept confidential. All you have to do is make a payment to them and they'll help you out, right? So they make it sound like they're doing a good thing for you, but they're not, right? And I don't know about you, but this is not something that I would want having printed off of all of our city's emails, because somebody's going to leak it to the press, and then it just kind of makes you look bad all the way around. So unfortunate. Another unfortunate thing, guess what? California in general leads the nation in data breaches. So we're the brunt of the target, unfortunately. So from a risk point of view, the likelihood, because of where our location, we're more likely to get hit. Now you understand how actuaries work, right? They take all these statistics and they use that to kind of figure out what the cost should be. So Californians are probably going to pay a little bit more for insurance premiums because we're more likely to get hit, and that's just statistically the case. So unfortunate for us. So what kind of impact does this have on local governments? Obviously, it has a huge impact on it. You have reputational impacts, right? You have elected officials who, people are going to start scratching their heads and saying, why are we voting for these people to do this? And our systems keep on getting hit. And it may take a little bit more of something adversely happening. Like, let's say 911 goes down, and because 911 is not down, someone dies because they don't get to the hospital fast enough because 911 couldn't answer the phone. That's when you're going to see that reputational impact really impact a local agency. Unfortunately, I think that's eventually going to happen. Just statistically, it's going to happen. And when that does, you're going to see an overturn. The voters are going to speak then. And that's when I think you'll start seeing elected officials start paying a little bit more attention to it, because their job is going to be on the line. And it's unfortunate it has to get to that. We can see that it's coming. We know that it's coming. Why aren't we dealing with it right now, right? So we have a lot of different things happening out there. Cyber attacks against local governments, taking out radios and mobile phones, or no, making them so they have to rely on radios and mobile phones, but taking out the dispatches and emails. And we all know that taking out radios and mobile phones isn't as difficult as it is. So if it was a nation state trying to do it, they could actually cripple us fairly, not easily. I don't want to say easily. They'd have to actually be here physically to do some of this stuff, but it's possible for them to do a really devastating attack, and we should consider that and try to avoid that. But some EMS services have a breach, right? And sometimes the breach may actually affect a third party that they rely on to provide services for them. So that's the thing to look at. But they're having delayed responses, and they had delayed responses in Dallas earlier this month, was reported because of it. Again, now if somebody dies because of that, that's when it's going to become a bigger issue, right? So we want to watch out for that. Ransomware trends, it's obviously some of them are getting to the point where they just attack your system, exfiltrate the data, and say, we're going to release the data on the internet if you don't pay us. They don't even bother encrypting your systems anymore. Some of them, right? Some of them will encrypt your system and exfiltrate the data. Some will just encrypt your systems. So knowing who you're dealing with is really important to know whether they are probably taking data out or not. If they're taking data out, then you have a data breach issue that you have to deal with. But we're looking at multiple levels of extortion that they're doing. And remember, they hit organizations multiple times. They try to target backups. They look for your insurance documentation to know how much your insurance is going to pay. So if you have $2 million worth of insurance, they're going to ask for $2 million worth of ransomware if they find that documentation. That's just the way they're working. It's unfortunate for us. But also, if they get information, an email addresses for your residents, or in this case, patients, they will then threaten the patients to get you to pay. Now, this is a really interesting one. Think about this. Your local government gets hit. They get everybody that paid for permits, they get all their information, their email addresses and names, and they send them the names and they say, hey, we have your personal information and we're going to release that on the dark web so that people can have your credit card number and have your name, your email address, where you live, your address, and all that kind of stuff, unless you tell the city to pay us for the ransom. Think of that. That's exactly what happened here in this hospital, right? They told they got nude pictures of people going through surgeries or whatever. They got those nude pictures and they sent those patients that information and said, hey, we have your nude pictures and those are going to go on the internet unless you tell the hospital to pay us. So talk about them really using hardball tactics. That's kicking it up another notch, another level, right? The other thing to think about is sometimes the local government doesn't necessarily get hit, but somebody you rely upon gets hit, and then that takes out your services. This is why it's really important for you when you take a look at your service providers that you're dealing with the service providers to make sure that they have security in there. So in this instance, Logan County got hit because they were unable to access data they had in the cloud because that cloud service went out. The county wasn't attacked, but it sort of wasn't indirectly through a third party. Third parties also get into supply chain issues, right? So you probably heard a lot of the things about security drones and the concern that a lot of the items come out of China. China makes a really good drone, but the question of the security of that drone, do they have chips embedded in that talk back to them, or are they able to get camera information from that drone and get it back to there? So we're seeing supply chain get hit, but then even the supply chain of the supply chain, further up the supply chain, is getting hit. That then leads to a breach in the supply chain that you rely upon. So it's becoming really, really difficult. Now, one other thing that's happening too is that the nation states are looking at this more on the lines of warfare and espionage. And for them, there's a really good book. It's called Russians Among Us. I don't know who the author of it is off the top of my head, but they talk about how Russia transitioned from spies that are living here in the United States to really getting into the more of the espionage via cyber. Not to say that they don't have sleeper cells still in the United States, but that they're using other methods as well. And it's really telling that they're doing this. China is doing the same thing. They're doing a lot of ransomwares make it look like it's a criminally motivated, not nation state motivated, so that they can actually espionage, they can actually get information out of you, intellectual property from organizations. That's what they're kind of targeting in there. You can see this is from 2021 saying that local governments are still a target. And you can see from the 2022 part, that's still the case. Local governments are still being targeted. And you have to think of local governments as being sometimes part of that 20% of health, part of that's local government. Education, that's part of that's local government, not all of it. But you still have that in here. And then you have like transportation as well in the second ones that are also part of government. So you got a lot of attacks that affect us. But you think about this, if they're also attacking Microsoft and we rely upon Microsoft, then they're also attacking our supply chain. So really this whole circle here is all us. So yes, Demetrius posted it up there. Yes, that's a really good book. Highly recommend you listen to it because it's going to take you from when we talk about the old-fashioned spies, that we talked about, to the new type of spies. Take you right into the cyber side of things. You have to get through the first part of the book until they get to the cyber stuff at the end of the book. But it's eye-opening, to say the least. So again, we've talked about this. The Ukrainian warfare is not limited to Russia and Ukraine. It's not a bordered war. It's a borderless war because it's all on the internet. And so we can see when they attack that there's an increase in attacks in Europe across the board, and then slight increases here in the United States. I don't know if this is still true. That's an older graphic, but when something happens in there, they're attacking us as well. And we talked about Taiwan, and we talked about China and their tensions there. And we also see recently, I think it was last week they reported this, the Department of Justice is linking Iran, China, and Russia to 5 different cases related to intellectual property theft. So they're attacking us because they may want to destabilize us for the war that they've got going on, or the war that they want to have going on. But they're also stealing our intellectual property, giving them an economic advantage over us. So there's a concerted effort, at least from those 3, and I think North Korea could probably fall into it, but it wasn't in this DOJ cases, but they're definitely all out to get us. Right? Hate to say it, but that is the case. And we see an uptipping activity, and President Biden said that last year at this time was talking about that. But we also see an increase in disinformation or mis or malinformation, and it's just different types of information, different ways of lying, I guess. But it's being used quite heavily in our current situation, and that is, how do we get wrong information out there to get the U.S. upset about different things and get liberals and conservatives fighting each other here in the United States? That is a tactic that we know Russia uses and did use, and we have proof of it from the last election. They're trying to polarize us so that while we're polarized and we're fighting amongst ourselves, they are, doing whatever other things that they're doing elsewhere in the world, right? But then we even get into deep fakes, right, where they have videos now, and it's getting really good out there. You can look online and look for deep fake stuff, and some of it you are going to have a hard time determining whether or not it was AI generated or if it was real. So I think Keenan Peele did a thing where they had Obama, a picture of Obama, and then they would talk, and then Obama would move with it. And you could, when you watch, you'd say, well, I could tell that's fake because his mouth doesn't move exactly that way. But it's getting better and better. With the help of AI, it's growing exponentially. So we're going to see a continuation of that. There's going to be more of that. You're going to have a harder time knowing whether something is legit or not going forward. So you can kind of see, here's some other things. And you can see Microsoft even had some information from their intelligence that they're warning that influence campaigns are wrapping up from Iran as well. So we've seen it from Russia. Russia has been using it for a long time. So seeing that there's an increase in it for Iran should be a good indication that Iran's planning something. Right. I don't know what they're planning, but there's something there going on. Usually when these things start to happen, we see that then the warfare switches to the kinetic side, right? Russia usually attacks and does a lot of disinformation before they invade. So not sure that that's what Iran's doing. They're a different threat actor. They have different motivations, and they have different techniques on how they do things. But we're going to start to see something in the Middle East with them doing it. There's a lot of information. CISA has some good information for you about how to stop disinformation. Part of that is our role in our agencies to make sure that, one, we let our staff understand that disinformation is something that's out there, but then in how to recognize it and how to question the sources, how to investigate it, and think before you share the information. But then also, how do we get that out to our local constituents, right? Because this should be a concern for us, especially when election time comes around, right? We want to make sure that people understand this before election time comes around. Because when elections are coming and then you try to tell them, well, that's disinformation, they're going to be like, oh, you're just saying that. you got to attack it before when it's not an issue. So this is something that each local government should probably be working on. We also have that China is connecting up with local leaders, our leaders that work for us in our local governments, trying to get them to move towards more favorable policies for China. City of Fremont is a huge recent case in that, where an aide that was here in the United States was, working on his team, the mayor's team, and was actually a Chinese national spy. So the idea, the hope was to get that person, influence that person. So if that person later came on to become a senator or a representative, either at the state or the federal level, that influence could continue. So you can see influence campaigns are coming in different ways. Some of them are the old-fashioned kind of espionage type of ways, but some of them are new ones, deep fakes and fake information and stuff like that that's going on. Yeah, I can't not talk about insider threats because we have insiders that are doing just as much damage as the outsiders do. So we have, cyber criminals, which we could talk about, but I'm not going to talk too much about them. We have nation states, we have insiders, on all of these, then we have hacktivists, and all of those different threats are attacking us, and each one of them has a different risk level. One of them that I think is really interesting, on the insider threat, some of it's malicious and some of it's just not malicious. It's just accidental or a case of making a mistake that probably should have been, could have been avoided. But we also see that employees are willing to sell, 20% of employees are willing to sell their work email and password for like $50 online. That is scary. I don't know about you, but again, what did I tell you? All we want to do, all the bad guys want to do is be able to get into your system, right? And all they need is a username and password to get in for anybody. And then they can start sending emails as that person. Someone will click on a link, put their username and password in, and then they'll have that username and password. All you got to get is somebody from IT to do it. So again, if we set up multi-factor authentication, it's going to stop that. Right. So, and the other thing that we run into is shadow IT, and that is people using IT that IT is not in control of. So a good example of that, and one of the things that's a big topic right now is AI, using chat AI and all that stuff. And that's becoming more of an issue. And the real question then comes down to, are we going to allow users to use it? Well, if they use ChatGPT or Google or the Microsoft chat, the problem is your organization have no control over it. So how is that information stored? How was it generated? All that kind of stuff. There's a lot of issues there, but they're using it now. Guarantee in your organization somebody's using it, and it's completely unchecked. IT may not even know that they're using it, and it may be generating false information. It might be storing information. They may be taking confidential information and putting it in the cloud that's now available somewhere else where it's not. Now, Microsoft's planning on releasing something that will exist in your Office 365. If you have Office 365, it'll exist in your environment and you have control over it, and it can access your files and learn from your organization. That's a great use of it. Then you have control over it. But when it's a public one and you have no control, or IT doesn't even know that it's being used, how is it being used? And it's not even that. How many people are using Dropbox and it's not city owned or controlled, right? Those types of things become what we call shadow IT, and those become a big risk for organizations. All of this can impact our bond rating. I just always like to throw that out there. It's starting to mean that local governments are going to start getting hit with this. We've already seen negative credit ratings actually come out for organizations because of cyber incidents. So it's real, it's going to happen, and it's going to affect your bond rating, which means there's different costs related going forward. You can talk to your finance folks about the impact on that. It's only going to get worse. Everything is the way the world's working, more and more stuff. I mean, just AI. Last year when I gave this thing, AI wasn't even a thing. We weren't even thinking. We were talking about using AI to monitor networks and stuff like that. Now we're talking about AI, and now it's a concern because people are using it out in the wild, and bad guys are now using it to craft better emails. So all of a sudden, overnight, it became an issue, right? And so we have to respond as quickly as that, and that's just the way technology is, and it will continue to do that. We're going to continue to see a lack of cybersecurity professionals. So RSA in 2022 said it was 5 million that were done. The World Economic Forum said there's 3 million jobs empty. So either way, millions of jobs, right? So it's really, really bad for the shortage of what we need for prevention. And we see that this is becoming a #1 risk for boards. Boards in the C-suite are starting to recognize it, and they're starting to get to the point where they're saying, hey, we need to do something about this. And the Securities and Exchange Commission is saying, hey, you're going to be forced to do this. In other words, if you're going to be on a board for a corporation, you're going to have a basic understanding of cybersecurity. That's the way it's going. And that's important. You can also see in the local government, and this is from the Marin County grand jury that recently came out in 2020, but also San Mateo County also had a grand jury. Both of them talked about having public discussions. The purpose of that is to make sure that council is involved in understanding the risks to the organization. They set the tone at the top for enterprise risk management, and cybersecurity is one of those things. And I'm going to skip through all of this because I want to get back to the next section here, which is going to talk about, I'm going to look at where it is. I'm always trying to figure out where I put it. So that's going to lead us right into the next section here that I wanted to talk about. And that is, where did it go? Oh, geez, the link doesn't work. Hold on. My bad. Technical difficulties here. I do this on purpose. I have all my stuff together because if somebody asks a question, I can always go back and say, okay, I have information about that. Let me get to it. But it also makes navigating sometimes a little bit different. So what is council's role? And so we talked about the threat, we've talked about the concerns. Now let's talk about like where do you start is always a question. And my point as an auditor in the past, my point was always, look, you need to start with the governance. You need to put governance in place so that in governance, when you have that in place, we'll make sure that all the other things get done right. And having proper enterprise risk management means that you're not just buying security products just to buy security products. In other words, you have an identified risk that you're trying to address, right? You have to have the processes and procedures in place to do that. Rushing out and buying multi-factor authentication, while it's good, you should do that. It's a no-brainer, one of those risks. But if you don't have the other processes in place to have that doing continuous risk management, you're going to end up still being a thing, because what you used to do, let's go back to like 2000. If I go back to 2000, I have my guidance listed from 2000. Of when I worked at Mason Associates, I also helped out with the Walnut Creek Chamber of Commerce, and they had a Think Security First initiative. And we said, okay, what are the things that people and small businesses need to do to protect themselves? And we're like, oh, it's really easy. You know, they just need to lock down their Wi-Fi, have antivirus, and do patch management, right? There's 3 things. If you just do those 3 things, everything will be great. And that might have been good 2000. It is not adequate today, right? It continuously evolves, and we have to continuously evolve with it and address those things. So we want to make sure that we get the governance in place. And this is not me talking necessarily. You can look at ICMA, the International City County Management Association. They did a survey in 2020, and they're in the process, I believe, of doing another one. The researcher that did the last one is working on doing another one. I don't know if that's going to come out in 2024 or not, but they're revising it. But one of the things that they found is top officials in the organizations are not engaged in cybersecurity at the highest levels. They're not sufficiently well informed or committed to cybersecurity, and they fail to insist on cyber safe culture and fail to act appropriately on their own responsibilities. In other words, they're not changing their passwords or doing multi-factor authentications like they should. Interesting, because Joe Biden had said, or Obama had said that, way back in 2009, all levels of government, federal government, the local government, we all have to work on it. It's not, you can't just say, oh, well, the federal government's going to work on it for us. No, you have to work on it yourself as well. And again, getting back to that Marin County, making sure that we have the public discussions. Now, that's a good question. Like, how much do you put into that public discussion? Obviously, you don't tell the public all your faults, because the bad guys will use that information against you. There are areas where you can have discussions with council about security threats, and it doesn't have to be public. But you should have public ones. So the way we did that at Livermore is we meet with council twice a year. It's in our cybersecurity policy, which is available on the MESAC website. If you're not a member of MESAC and you send me an email, I can send it to you. Do it before next week. But in our policy, it says we report to the council twice a year. One time in October during Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we do a general kind of like what I just did at the beginning of this presentation. Like, what's the threat landscape? What's going on in cybersecurity today? Not about us specifically. Then in the springtime, we meet with council and we talk about specifically before budget, hopefully, so that they can, when they understand when they're doing the budget, okay, where is our cybersecurity stuff? Where are we at? And then how does that align with the budget request that is before us, right? So then we tell them about any instance we have, we tell them about what we want to do for the budget. And then when they're making a decision, they'll be informed. You may wonder why in some questionnaires that you get either from insurance companies or stuff like that, they ask, do you have a line item for cybersecurity in your budget? That's one of the reasons, right? They don't tell you that that's why they're asking for the reason, but they're asking because that means that council has some awareness of cybersecurity. And it's hard for a council member to say, I don't know anything about cybersecurity. It's in the budget that you approved. How do you not know about it, right? So there's reasons for that. Now, I think what people have not understood is that everybody is touched by digital world. Everything we do in a city is touched, or a district or anywhere is touched by it. You think, well, the gardeners aren't. Well, no, they are. How do you pay them, right? How do you get their schedule? How do you order fuel for their machines? How do you charge the batteries if they have batteries, right? All of that relies on technology, right? I think about this. Think about filling a pothole. How many steps along the way from the beginning of a project of doing a pothole, fixing it till it's actually fixed? How many steps along that way rely upon computers? Almost all of them, except for maybe putting the actual asphalt in the ground, right? But you're going to have to order the asphalt. You're going to have to use what to do that? A phone, or you're going to use the internet to do it, right? You have to have a contract. How are you going to do the contract, right? You're going to write it up in Word or whatever, or procure it with a PO. All this stuff's done electronically. We don't think about it. How are you going to pay the employees? How are you going to schedule the employees? All done electronically sometimes, right? So when you think about it, you rely upon technology. And so if all of that technology all of a sudden stopped, you can't order asphalt and you can't pay your employees. How are you going to do that job? Again, so we don't always think about it, but I always talk about, it's like cooking a lobster. Go back to the 90s. Think about your agent, if you're around in the 90s. Think about your agency in the 90s. You may have had one email, maybe a city of Livermore at AOL.com or something like that, right? And it was a novelty to get an email. Nowadays, it's something we rely upon, right? So there's been a difference. Our reliance on cybersecurity over the last 20 years has increased to the point where it's critical. But along that way, have we addressed cybersecurity as if it is as critical as that as we've gone? No. It's just now that we're starting to say, oh, wow, this is really critical. We need to start dealing with it because all these bad things. But you think about how you cook a lobster, right? You put it in the water when the water's lukewarm, and then you turn on it and you boil it. And the lobster doesn't realize that slowly over time, it's getting cooked. And same thing with us. Slowly over time, we're not realizing that we're getting cooked. So we increased our reliance on that. Our risk has gone up, right? Now there's AI that we should be using. It's a good innovation. It's going to revolutionize the way we work. You think the internet was a big deal? AI is going to be a bigger deal. You thought mobile devices was a big deal? AI is going to be a bigger deal, right? It's just starting now, and it's already making huge changes in the way we work, right? It's coming. The question is, are we attuned to the fact that changes risk, right? With this huge innovation comes a huge amount of new risk that we need to address, right? And like I said, your employees are probably already using AI. The question then is, what are you doing to address the risk? Do you have an AI policy? Do you have even guidelines? Do you have any training? Have you even talked to them about it and what you would expect them to do with it? I'm coming up with a blog post. It'll be out by next week about, just interim guidance that you can use until you have a policy. Like telling folks, don't put any confidential information in it. You would think you don't have to say that, but you have to, right? You're only as weak, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So it's better to lay everything out and come up with some guidance on that rather than waiting to something bad happen. All of this that I want to say is that cyber risk is enterprise risk. It's not IT risk, right? Disinformation has nothing to do with IT, and yet it's a risk that you have, and you have to deal with it. It's not an IT issue. It's a public relations issue maybe, but it's definitely a cyber issue for sure. You have a cyber risk, but it's enterprise risk. And hopefully you understand now that I say, hey, our reliance on it means that our ability to do our mission may be impacted because of the lack thereof of IT. So that's a risk. So there's big points that I want to make in that. And I know that for most local governments, cybersecurity is in IT. And there are some operational aspects of cybersecurity that belong inside of IT. Fully understand that. But there's some aspects of it, governance, risk, and compliance side of IT and strategy or cybersecurity that belong outside of it in a separate reporting structure. And you're starting to see local governments do that. Some of the local governments that recently been hit in this slide are now in the talks of how to do that. Where do you put it? And everybody's got different ideas of where to stick it. So it's not a part of IT, so it's separate. But the discussion's happening. City of Livermore, when they hired me, we have it separate. And Santa Clara County also has it separate. They followed kind of our lead after we kind of did it. So you're going to start to see that separation. Recommend that you be on the front end of that, not on the back end of it, so that you can start working on making sure that there's oversight on what IT is doing. So the thing is that cybersecurity is a top risk for all local organizations, but we're not any different than the private sector in that, other than our systems are typically more complicated. Our lines of business are more complicated. And so for our risk is going to be a little bit higher than theirs. So you can look at all these different AICPA, CalCPA, CISA, American Water Works Association, the Global Risk Report. All of them say number one risk is cybersecurity, right? And the question is, are we paying enough attention to that? So, and so we're starting to see, and with all those numbers of all the risks and vulnerabilities and everything increasing, and our reliance on data to do business is increasing, you're going to see that it's really the part that needs to be understood is that is actually a central responsibility of the entire C-suite and board. And for local governments, that means your executive team, and that means your elected officials or appointed, depending upon how you're set up. And that comes from PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and their recent, managing business risk, right? They are telling you cyber is a business risk, and it is the business of the board. And so my point, hopefully you got it, is that it's not an IT issue. Cybersecurity is your response to cyber risk, and not all those cyber risks are related to IT. And so why is IT in charge of it? It shouldn't be. And they got their own stuff they got to deal with. And they're going to throw a whole bunch of other stuff on top of them, areas that they're not necessarily informed in or been taught about or whatever. I mean, a lot of cyber risk overlaps with financial risk, liability risk, other types of risk overlap with it, right? So if you start to consider that, like, taking the names of residents, for them to report where trees are or something like that, which seems completely innocuous, but then you ask for the name and address of the person and their email address, making that information available inside your system. If a hacker gets into it, they got that information now, right? And so, yeah, that may seem like it has nothing to do with IT, but it's about the data that you have, and now you're retaining data that arguably I don't think you need. Do you really need the name of the person who reported where the tree was? I don't think so. Maybe it's interesting statistic information, but if you're not going to use the information for an actual statistical reason, why are you saving it? That you just now have information that bad guys, if they ever get into your system, can now use and leverage possibly against you. So if you don't need it, don't have it, right? And again, that's really has nothing to do with really IT. That's just more of a business process, right? But somebody needs to work with the business units to get them to understand that. How they handle and use data is going to be a part of that, right? Some other areas that are outside of IT, operational technology. This is your SCADA or your ICS systems. With most organizations, we have a water treatment plant here in the city of Livermore. And the people that run the security for the SCADA system are not IT folks. IT has nothing to do with it. The people that do it are engineers. And those engineers were not, when they were trained, were not trained on security aspects of those systems. And if they were, it was very little. And it certainly isn't keeping up to date with all the new stuff that's coming out, right? So in the city of Livermore, I'm in charge of cybersecurity, and it covers that area as well. So my responsibility covers the ICS systems as well, our operational technology, as well as IT. And so it's another use of that. Disinformation, we kind of talked about that earlier, has nothing to do with that. Privacy is not really security, it's a different issue altogether. Compliance, how can IT check its own compliance? That should be obvious that is a violation of segregation of duties, right? So if you're looking at compliance, whether it's PCI compliance, HIPAA compliance, or CJIS compliance, the individuals that are looking at it should not be a part of the control environment. I mean, that's just a simple 101, for separation of duties. So if you're going to deal with compliance, then somebody needs to deal with it. It needs to not be a part of IT. Ethical use of technology, especially AI, is a big thing. What about bias in it? Right, that's a whole different air shooting match and ball of wax that we have to deal with. Another type of cyber risk that we're dealing with that overlaps with, personnel risk in a way. It may also overlap with litigation risk, if it's AI is being used in law enforcement, right? So there's some areas there where those areas, HR, law enforcement, needs the expertise of somebody from cyber that can explain, okay, if you use AI like this is the type of information will be in there. This is how that information could get out. I'm sure they'll understand how that information could, but then also if you rely upon information, that information is biased, how does that impact the organization? And we also are finally starting to see with critical infrastructure, there's this convergence of information and physical security together. And again, physical security is kind of most local governments, they say, oh, PD will take care of it, but they're not really. PD is not physical security folks. There are police officers. They deal with the public. They don't deal with, securing a facility, right? That's not their job, not their role, not their training. And I think many of them would be offended that you were going to make them be a security guard. So you should also see that you'll see a lot of organizations where physical security is coming together. The federal government did that. The new agency I'm going to go work for is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, right? Physical security and cybersecurity together. So you're starting to see that happen in the industry. In fact, if you go to a large corporation, they either have a CISO or a CSO, Chief Security Officer or Chief Information Security Officer, and typically physical and cybersecurity both report to them. That's a very common trend that you're now starting to see. So, and physical security gets in, in the corporate world, it has a lot of other moving things like loss prevention and other stuff that, maybe in a local government we wouldn't be necessarily looking at. But needless to say, so what did the ICMA cybersecurity survey say? It's important that cyber risk is understood, especially by top elected and appointed officials. Now, the top elected and appointed officials and city managers all read PM magazine, ICMA's magazine. It's all something that they've seen. Maybe they didn't read this particular article, but they're aware of it. And so the question is, what are they doing about it is the question. It's like, in a legal terms, you've been notified, right? So the next question is like, are you doing your due diligence? Are you doing, based upon this information, what are you doing about that? So do they know what actions need to be taken to protect information? Do they know the gap between what actual cybersecurity practices are and those that are recommended? So it's important for them to understand it so that they can be able to have a conversation about it. We're not expecting them to get into any of the weeds. Elected officials don't need to understand about multi-factor authentication, why it's important, all that kind of stuff. They just need to understand what the risks are in general and at a high level. Their job is like three things, right? They hire and fire the city manager, they set strategy, and they provide oversight. So setting the strategy and providing oversight for cybersecurity, how does that happen, right? That's the question at the end of the day. And remember, that's the number one risk they have. and they're not sufficiently engaged according to this survey. Some of the barriers that we're running into that came up during that cybersecurity survey is insufficient funds, insufficient staff, lack of adequate training, and inability to pay competitive salaries. Notice all of those usually are separated around funding. You go back to when we talked about how much are you spending on cybersecurity. If these are the barriers that are preventing your organization from implementing cybersecurity, it's typically related to funding. And so if that's 0 to 10% or 3% or whatever your percentage is, it's not enough, right? We have to address these areas. And until we address those areas, we're going to be in a bad situation, and we're not going to be able to respond when an actual incident happens. So making sure that that risk management, whatever we're going to report to council or the board members, is make them be so they can make strategic decisions, especially around budget. But then on the oversight side of things, which it gets talked about a lot less, and that is, how do they hold executive team accountable for doing or not doing those things? That becomes the more interesting part, right? So now there's guidance for all of this stuff. The problem with the guidance is it's typically written towards board of directors and not councils. And so a lot of council members or even city people say, well, that's for corporations, doesn't apply to us. Wrong. It applies to you, and for the same reason, right? You have a public trust issue. You have taxpayer money. And if you issue bonds, then you have investors that invested in you as well. So you have responsibility to your investors, so you can pay back your bonds, and you have a responsibility to taxpayers. Same reasons why corporations are asked to do these things, because they're responding to investors, right? We just have taxpayers on top of it that we're responsible to. And so we have to understand that we have a responsibility for it. We can't just shuck it. And a lot of them do it. So what are some of the things that we can do for local governments? So part of this is MISAC. I didn't mention this when we first started up. MISAC, the Municipal Information System Association in California. I am one of the chairs for the Cybersecurity Committee, and the Cybersecurity Committee, along with the coalition of city CISOs and members from CISDA, which is the California County Information Systems Directors Association, are working on a white paper or a guide for elected and appointed officials on what their responsibility is and how they can implement these things we're talking about, providing the oversight and providing the strategy, right? And so I think that that's the key thing here. And so we've taken 5 key principles. They align extremely closely with the cyber risk oversight, which is the NACD's guide for board members. They don't perfectly align because the NACD talks about enterprise risk, and a big section of that is like mergers and acquisitions. We don't have that kind of a risk in local government, so it's not worth us talking about. But we talk about all the other kinds of things, and so I'm going to go over that with you now. The guide is not ready yet, but it will be ready soon. If you get my personal email address, you can take a look at that. I'll also send you, before we end, I'll give you a link to my blog if you don't have it, so that you can follow up, because I write about all of these topics in my blog, and so there may be some information you like there. First thing, enterprise risk. So the first thing is more of an understanding. They have to understand what I've kind of explained to you up to this point, is that cyber risk is enterprise risk, and it's strategic. Remember, this is the #1 risk that most organizations have, and so they have to understand that there's risks, and we're responding to those risks, right? Now, a lot of you probably, because you're in, CGI or PRMA, are you're risk professionals, right? And so for you, I'm talking like it totally makes sense to you, right? Problem is, when I talk to IT people about cyber risk, they don't kind of understand it because they have a different vocabulary, right? So you'll get it because I'm talking about a type of risk, and I'm talking about handling that risk like we handle other risks, right? That's where the disconnect is too. A lot of IT folks are not necessarily understand the lingo that risk managers use. Another problem too is I come from an audit background, so they don't always understand when I talk about controls or control implementation or control environment. Those are all audit terms. They're very specific, mean something to me. that other auditors and finance people understand. So that's part of like knowing your audience and responding to this. So I'm talking to you guys, I'm talking more about the cyber risk side of things. When I talk to finance people, I talk more about the control and control environments, right? They're interested in risk as well, but not as much as they are about the control environment, because they're a very regulated group, right? They have a lot of government accounting standards boards, and so they know, hey, there's a regulation, we follow it this way. So, so when you're talking to different individuals from a cybersecurity point of view, you have to kind of talk in different terms. Like if I go and talk to IT, I can talk in much more technical terms than I do ever with anybody else. I try to avoid that because even sometimes there, depending on their skill level and knowledge level, they may not necessarily understand the technical aspects of it. But so my point is understanding that it's cyber risk is intuitive to this group, the group that I'm talking to now. It's not going to be intuitive to everybody else. And so we have to understand that as risk professionals, that when we talk to other folks, we have to talk to them about the risks, right, in a way that they can understand. Like, and at the end of the day, is like, how does it impact the city or the district or the county ability to provide services to the residents to survive an incident? Talk about those things, right? Because we can talk too much about risk and then it'll go over their heads and then we won't get anywhere. But they have to understand that it really is. And so for us, we have to tie it together. One way, and and I know many of you may not be MESAC members, but yesterday we did a webinar and it's only available to MESAC members, unfortunately, because we talked about doing tabletop exercises. And one of the things that was brought up is like bringing your executive team to the tabletop exercise. So if you go through the tabletop exercise, it firmly, in their minds, will connect the risk to an incident to their ability to continue operations and to provide services, right? And that connection is what needs to be made so that they understand, okay, cyber risk is about making sure that I can continue to be city manager, make sure that I can continue to do this speech, make sure that we can have a public, council meeting. All of those things rely upon cyber something, technology or data, right? And so we have to make that connection to them. And so if you go through a tabletop exercise with them and as a part of the tabletop exercise, you talk about, okay, hackers attacked us and this system went down and now they're threatening to release the information and police cannot answer calls because the system that went down is 911. Now they all connect it. They say, okay, we can't answer responses because 911's down. And then they can make the connection, right? And the important thing is if you do a good tabletop exercise is you talk about, you ask the IT folks, okay, what do you have in place to prevent this, right? And then they'll talk about it. And now, the executive managements are putting two and two together. That's why we have this. That's why IT is asking for those things. You're making it very solid. So I can't talk enough about tabletop exercises and how they help your organization get the message across. One of the things that nobody agrees with me on is whether or not the council should be involved in those. I think my opinion is I think they should. One of the recommendations by corporate attorneys during RSA a couple of weeks ago was that board of directors, members, at least one member of the board of directors should be a part of the tabletop exercises so that they understand what it is and they can relay that information back. The problem is making sure that they stay in their lane, right? A council member or a board of directors, they provide oversight and strategy. They're not supposed to be micromanagers, right? And so we want to make sure that if you invite them, that they're going to be that micromanager. The problem is your executive team is going to act completely different if they're in the room. That's the other problem that you run into. And they're going to try and save face. They're going to try and put the best foot forward because they want to look as good as they can in front of elected officials. And that's unfortunate because really it needs to be open and transparent type of event. You want to air out your dirty laundry before you have an incident, right? It's better to sweat in exercise or training than it is to bleed in battle. And it's a thing we always talked about when we were in the Marine Corps and why we did so much training. Why do so much training? So you don't bleed in battle, right? So I'm sure if you explain it to councils that way, that they would understand and say, okay, this is my role. I understand what my role is. And I understand also that we want to find those things. And then I want to make sure that those things get fixed. But then here's the thing, here's the kicker. If they were there and they actually follow that role, then council could say, well, those things that they talked about that need to be fixed, do you have a plan for it? A lot of people don't want to hear that from a council member because a council member, but that's their job of oversight, making sure that you're doing these things. So I don't know. This is going to be one of those ones that I know that people have an issue with, but I don't think if you think through the logic and you think through it from a risk point of view and what people's roles and responsibilities are supposed to be, it makes sense. Reality is not always the same. So, and I get that. Everybody's organization is going to be different. So if your organization is different, then you'll have to address it differently. At the end of the day, however you do it, they need to understand cyber risk is enterprise risk at the end of the day. So however you get that, whatever works best for your organization, not every elected official is the same. Not every city manager is the same. Not every district manager is the same. However, you just have to figure out how it is, right? So that's the thing that needs to get done is they need to understand that it's a risk and that they have a role in it. Part of their role, why a lot of the questionnaires that you get say, is there a line item for cybersecurity? When I first saw that, it was actually when NIST 853 control catalog, one of the controls was, did you have a budget for this? And I'm like, yeah, okay. And I was an auditor at the time, so I'm just asking for a budget. Do you have a budget line item? No, it's part of IT. Well, you guys are wrong. You should be doing this. I thought it was kind of interesting that that people without question is like, okay, why are we asking about the budget, right? Because if I would have stopped to think about it, I'm like, okay, why is the budget? Let's go back to governance. Why do we have oh, that's right, because we want to make sure that management's involved and supported and understands that we are doing things, right? At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. We want to make sure that you're covering it. Now, the thing with budget, I kind of already talked about earlier, it's going to be an issue. It's like, oh, there's going to be this tendency to say, what is the neighbor doing? What is city XYZ next door doing? How much are they spending? How much of their budget? What is their percentage? And you're going to think that that is being a good guideline for your organization. No, don't do that. Right? Gartner actually came out with a thing and said, look, the whole point of your budget is to for cybersecurity is to reduce risk to an acceptable level. And what is acceptable for one city may not be acceptable to another. What risk one city has may not be what another city has. I have a water treatment plant. I have a lot more different risks than our city next door to us because they don't have a water treatment plant, right? I have a whole nother business unit that has risks, right? I have an airport. Nobody else around us has an airport. Different set of risks altogether, right? So we have to understand that. So we can't just pick a number and say, hey, this is the average and this is what we should be. Industry average is about 15%. From a different source. I forgot what the source was on that one. Local governments are lower than that. I mean, we got 3%, 0 to 3, or 0 to 10%. So none of those are close to 15. So if you did want to use this as a guide, well, you're not in the ballpark. Now, it's about 35% of the IT budgets in industries that feel that cybersecurity is being addressed at an acceptable level. So that tells us we're on the low end of this spectrum. It's not telling us where we should go. So what do I want you to take away from the numbers I gave you? We're not spending enough. All right. But we need to spend the money wisely based upon risks. And when we do, we'll mitigate risk to an acceptable level. And then when we check the numbers, it's going to be higher than probably 15%. That's what I'm saying. But don't rely upon it. If it comes in at 15%, maybe it comes in at 10%. Maybe that's fine. If you've reduced it to an acceptable level, then great. We're good. So resist the comparison, but the comparison is a good idea to just kind of give you an idea. But the other thing that's wrong with this, that in case if you get questioned on this, if you bring this up, is what do you put a firewall in? Is that a part of cybersecurity budget, or is that a part of infrastructure budget? Good question, right? Now, all these people over here that all these statistics come from, where did they put it? You don't know. So even if you had these numbers, they're a vague, at best, guideline. Or I don't even want to call it a guideline. I just want to say it's a vague notion of where you might want to be, not necessarily anything that you should use as a fast and hard rule. But in general, we can tell we're not spending enough. So that's what you can do with it. Oversight. Now, this is a huge part, right? So one of the things I talked about for council is they would provide oversight. So how do they provide that oversight, right? So one of the things that we're looking for is similar to financial literacy, right? You have training for council members so they can read the budget, right? Usually on a board of directors, the people will have the training before they ever get to it in a corporate environment, right? They're required to have, some kind of financial background so that they can read a profit and loss statement and understand what's being talked about. Council needs the same level of cyber literacy. They don't have to be experts in literacy. And, in the corporate world, and even in I'm going to compare with finance so that you understand this. Council gets taught some basics about how to read financial statements. Great. So they understand financial statements, but they're not experts on it. But do they rely upon finance director to tell them, yeah, those numbers are correct? No, they don't. They rely upon experts called auditors who are independent, who do an assessment, come back and report the information to council, right? Now, let's apply that to cybersecurity. They need to have a basic literacy about understanding the number one risk that faces local governments. Great, we can do that. We can train them on that. Now, do they rely upon the IT manager to tell them that, or do they need an independent source to give them that information? Right? Now, if they don't have cybersecurity and it's not separate from IT, they may want to have an external auditor provide that. Now, here's the thing: a lot of external folks that do security assessments are not doing what is necessary for council to make their decisions. As a former auditor, I could create a report that would do that. A lot of the technical people will give you like a vulnerability scan report. That is not an assessment of the internal control environment or the level of cyber risk that you have. So you have to be careful about what you ask for the assessment. You got to ask for the right one, so that they can get the information that they need so that they can make decisions upon strategy and what needs to be done. The other way is if you have a CISO and it's separate from them, or you have an internal audit function, if you're a large enough city or agency, then council can get that independent information from a different location, right? So they can rely upon it. They can have assurance that the organization is following the same guidelines. But here's the kicker, and this is the hard one, and that is if they're providing oversight, part of that is making sure management's doing their job to make sure that cybersecurity or cyber risk is being managed. And so that role of CISO becomes really kind of important. And in the corporate world, it's usually at the top. And even more so with the Security and Exchange Commissions, they're almost wanting somebody at that level on the board. You're not going to get that in an elected office because it's just not going to work. You can't say, okay, you can only elect somebody who's a cybersecurity professional. It's not going to work, right? So that's not going to happen. But that expertise is still required and needed to be there. So where is it going to come from? Does it come from outside the organization? Maybe a bunch of cities get a CISO like this and share it. Or can they get the information from an internal audit thing where it's separate, or do they get it from the city attorney's office? I don't know. Every organization will be different. They got to figure out how they're going to try and fix that, but they need to understand that, and they need to make sure that they have a mandate for that CISO that they're going to get reported on the current state of cyber risk in the organization, right? That's their oversight. And then if management's not doing enough for it, then they should respond. Right? They should hold the executive team accountable for those things. We've had security breaches where it's more often that the CISO or the security manager gets fired than it is the CEO gets fired. Not exclusively. There's been some instances where the CEOs were fired, yes. But here's the thing. If the CEO is not giving the CISO, the cybersecurity folks, enough budget or giving them what they need in order to do their job, why is it you're firing that person? Why aren't you firing the real problem, right? The executive. So that's the thing that needs to be understood. And I think I always used to say this, and it may seem a little crass or whatever, but there's nothing like public executions to get people to really pay attention, right? Back in the old days, that's how you made sure you maintained law and order. And I kind of think it applies here too. Until city managers are actually held accountable for these incidents, they're not going to take it as seriously as they need to, which is unfortunate. But you would think after Boston and Atlanta, or Baltimore and Atlanta had such a big and catastrophic thing, that they would do something about it and be more involved and more try to get more educated about cyber risk. But what is it? 4 years later, Dallas and Oakland just got hit. Two other big, huge cities just got hit. It's not changed, not going away, but are we getting management involved, and are they providing necessary response to these things? That's for council to decide. That's not my job or our jobs. Council needs to figure out whether or not they are doing what they think is due diligence, and that, which gets into a whole legal question, which I'll probably just avoid because that's a whole nother rabbit trail. But framework. So part of picking out what the strategy is going to be for an organization is figuring out what the framework ought to be. Like, what standard do you want them to follow? And so there's a lot of them out there that you can look at. Critical infrastructure, which is all of us local governments kind of fall under that, is recommended by the federal government to follow the cybersecurity framework by NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technologies. So I always recommend you use it. I think it's also really good when you want to communicate with council about it, because it makes sense. And I don't know if I have slides on that or not, but if I do, I will. So anyways, the idea is you get the framework, you get there, and then the cybersecurity, the governance, risk, and compliance side of cybersecurity can then do the assessments and test the controls on the IT side of cybersecurity, and then report back what that is against that framework. But they need to work together with all the other parts of the agency. My role here, I deal with every department division. They all have technology. They all rely upon it. I try to be their advisor on what they need to do to avoid those risks and what they can do those. I try not to say no to stuff. I say yes, but because at the end of the day, they have a job that they're trying to accomplish, and I want them to accomplish that, right? So again, that whole idea of enterprise risk, and this is where I think risk management and cybersecurity can kind of go together. Even emergency response, if it's separate from PD and fire, you can put those functions together. Even with physical security, right? You can put those 4 functions together, and you could call it enterprise risk management. At the end of the day, that's completely accurate, right? It's like, how do we address and mitigate risks, and how do we respond to it if it happens, right? Risk management, cybersecurity, emergency management, and physical security all connect right together, right? You think about it, how many of you deal with active shooter threats or do the training for it, right? Maybe HR does it, and a lot of times the city here, risk management does it, right? That kind of overlaps with physical security, right? Right. So how do we kind of put these functions that all kind of work together, because they're all really dealing with enterprise risk in different ways, so they can report up maybe a holistic view of all the city's risks, not just cyber risk, right? That would be interesting. I haven't seen that done yet. I know of a city in Southern California that does have something similar, where risk manager, I was talking to him at the Parma conference, he said, they just assigned cybersecurity to me and I don't even know anything about it. And I was like, well, it's not as bad as you think. So, yeah, so there's definitely a trend that's going on. Where exactly it'll work out in your organization is going to be different. Next thing is about monitoring and reporting. Like, how do we get this information? How do we get it to council? And that's the part where if you use the cybersecurity framework, you can then respond to them based on the 5 pillars that it has. And the 5 pillars are your ability to identify what you have, like your inventory. Do you know all this devices and data that you have? Do you know all your requirements, whether they're contractual or legal? Do you, the next one is your ability to protect. So what controls you put in place to kind of avoid the incident? And then the other three are your ability to respond, recover, and I lost my mind right there. But your ability to detect, respond, and recover. There you go. So your ability to detect becomes really important. But if you look at the cybersecurity framework, there's a whole bunch of controls underneath that. You just need to tell the council our ability to detect. We have these 5 things on the budget help us with our ability to detect an incident. And then, you can talk to them about statistics. The statistics is that it takes more than 6 months after a hacker gets into your system, typically our average, before you find them. So in other words, they're in your network for 6 months before you typically find them. That's the average. That means some places it's a lot longer than that. In fact, in one of the recent reports, it was 2 years the bad guys were in the system, right? So if you can report based upon that framework, it makes it a lot easier for council to understand. And then you're only talking about 5 different things, right? At the end of the day. And that's how you make relevant, reader-friendly, but you can still convey meaning to them. They can understand it. So I'm going to show you an example of this. So here's the cybersecurity framework. It's on the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And all local agencies, if they want federal funding for certain things, have to fill out what's called the NCSR, National Cybersecurity Review. When you fill that out, they give you a score. So you can fill that out every year, and then you use that to report to council at what your score levels are. You want a score of 7, that would be like perfection, right? And you can see, like with these scores, hey, if I'm talking to council, councils can say, hey, why did respond go down from last year? Well, you cut the budget, right? You can have that conversation, right? Because the ability to respond has changed. And you can say, oh yeah, we're making progress in all the other areas. We went backwards in response area. So our ability to respond, let's focus that. That gives council something to talk about. They can have a discussion about it, and they can set a strategy and say, we want you to work on your ability to respond to an incident. This is why it's so important to use something like the cybersecurity framework. There's a lot of other frameworks that you can use. None of them are going to be as clear as this when you try to report it to an elected official or even somebody and the executive team. They can understand this. They understand an incident. You want to be able to protect it. You want to be able to detect it happen. You want to be able to respond to it, and you want to be able to recover, right? They can understand that. It's easy for them to understand. You don't have to talk about anything technical when you do this, right? Makes it really easy. You can also take this and say, okay, all these different areas, all these different controls or things that I have in my budget, here's where they all fit into the cybersecurity framework, right? So everything can be completely justified under the budget, under the cybersecurity framework, right? Everything you're going to do is going to fit in one of those buckets. A lot of things fit under identify that you might not think about, like the governance side of things or doing risk assessments, all that stuff fits under identify if you lead all the subcontrols. Now, there's like 200 and some odd controls underneath all of this that you should have, or control objectives, sorry, that are underneath this that you would want to implement. But this gives you a place to start, right? Gives you a place to report, and it gets them involved. And if they're involved, something will get done about it. If they're not involved, we all know what happens. If they don't think it's important, does the city manager think it's important? Probably not, right? So this talks about all those different things. So City of Livermore, we have overall goals the council has, and underneath it, we have cascading goals underneath it. And what I did with our goals cascade is I added the cybersecurity as sub goals underneath it, right? And then I can put objectives, the control objectives actually underneath it. So then I can use, we use like Asana, it can roll up to a dashboard for the city manager. So we can actually use this as a means to do that, right? So the main thing that they want to understand is that they have to own the problem. Right? It's enterprise risk at the end, and they need to address it. So what I want to do is like open it up for any questions. I know I talked for quite a bit. I'm going to post down. I have a Discord server, if anybody is familiar with Discord, that keeps track of all these articles I talk about and all the inference. We call that open source threat intelligence, what's available in the news. And you can check that out. And I've put it in there. And I will put my email address in there, and I also put my blog in there because there's a lot of stuff on there. With that, is there any questions anybody has? And I guess you can come off mute if you have a question. And if you're thinking about doing any tabletop exercises, the CISA, my new employer, does them for free for local governments. So if you contact me, I can get you set up with them, and they can help you with that. If you want to do it yourself, if you look on my blog here, I have different resources, and I think it's tools and services. If you go to tools and services, there's all this stuff about tabletop exercises. You can get them and you can do them yourself. I think it's a little bit better if you have somebody outside your organization do them, but it's worth checking out. Any questions at all? I answered all your questions. That's amazing.
Hello, Donald. This is
Yes.
Demetrius from the city of Alameda.
Yes.
Great presentation, by the way. I always enjoy all your presentations, very informational. Quick question. So now that you're going to CISA, to that agency, does that mean you won't be holding these anymore?
No, actually, one of my roles is to publicize this type of information. I don't know exactly how it works, but I don't know if you've ever met Mario. He is a cybersecurity advisor for them, and he goes to all the conferences. I think he's done presentations as well. I may still do some on my own because I don't know what the restraints on what I can say is. You know what I mean?
Got it. Got it. Okay.
But I've always done them on my own, even when I worked at Maze. Some of them that weren't attached to my employment, just because you want to get the information out and do that. This is the Discord server if anybody's interested. We basically, it's kind of like a old-fashioned threads, but there's a link in here if you want to join it. But we have rules. Don't post anything that's not generally available in the public. But then if you wanted to look up something like liability, these are some informational resources about liability. And if you come across the news article you see, you can post it here too. It's not supposed to be just me doing all this stuff. If you want to look at any of those cyber incidents I talked about, here they all are. And I try to focus it just on local government stuff. So I don't try to get into any other areas. A good area that you might guys want to look at, since I talked a little bit about that today, is under the governance area, the compliance area, and the risk area, talking about different risks and stuff like that. It's just it's a tool. If you haven't used it, a lot of gamers use it, but it's a very useful tool for us to post a link and it's available and divide it up by its importance or what area it kind of fits in. Like, let's say I talked about the Microsoft report, and there's like hundreds of these reports every year from different agencies. I post them all here. So you can actually go back and find the reports, and you don't have to look it up. You can just go click on it. And as new things get posted, we post them up here as well. And if you know one that isn't here, go ahead and post it. That's the whole thing. It's supposed to be collaborative. Although I do most of the posting, but that's just because for me, it makes my job easy when I try to do a presentation like this. So I was like, oh, I need to have a few stories about recent incidents so I can go back and look at it really quickly and say, okay, I'm going to talk about these places. And then look, you can even see where my statistics come from. So, and you go back and find the reports. So there's a lot of different areas in there, even collaboration, like why local governments should work together to help with cybersecurity. So there's actually some interesting stuff, even getting articles from the Harvard Business Review. So it's really good information that we're posting up here. So feel free to join if you want. The link's in the thing. And then, well, thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, the slide deck will be available to you. As you saw, my slide deck was really big and has like 500 slides in it. I got to take out all the slides that I didn't present on and just give you the ones that are related to today, because 500 would be like a book. And I use that so I can jump around if there was a question about something. Like if one of you asked a question like, well, what's a typical organizational structure for a CISO? I have actual graphics for it, and I could have jumped to it and showed you. So
Hey, Don, how would it be if I sent the slide deck with the recording to all the participants?
yeah, no, that's fine. That's
Okay.
perfectly fine.
Perfect. Well, we thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, everybody. And my email is in there, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And even in my new role, I should be able to help you with any of those things. Although I
Thank
may
you.
not be in your area, but I can get you to the right person for it. So,
Nice. Thank you so much.
well, thanks, everybody.
Great job, Don.